Okay, so I want to have a look at this relationship between power and politics and organisational change. And really, the purpose of this really is to think, well, if we understand a little bit more about this environment or the context in which we're bringing about change, this messy organisational landscape, if we all understand that and can make sense of that, perhaps we can implement change in a more effective way. So really this starts out by thinking about what are organisations like. Think about organisations in a different way. And fundamentally, when we're looking at power and politics, what we're really saying is that organisations are political systems. Or political entities. They're political in nature. So we sometimes talk about, oh, it's a very political organisation, or lots of politics in my organisation, in a negative way in some respects. And that can be the case. That can get in the way of change. But what I'm arguing here is that is the nature of organisations. They're set up to be political. The way we set them up and the way we organise. So where does that come from? What do we really mean by that? And why are they political? Well, really fundamentally, the way we set organisations up is really highly unequal or asymmetrical relationships. Fundamentally the way we sit. If we're talking about a very small organisation or a cooperative, there are other organisational forms that try to get over this and perhaps have a series of partners. But the majority of organisations are really built around hierarchies. So what does that look like? We often have a conventional sort of organisational tree where we've got a lot of power at the top of the power in the hands of a few people at the top of the organisation, and power reduces as we go down that. And most people sit at the bottom of the organisation. So authority rests in the hands of the few. Decision making rests in the hands of a relatively small groups of people as we move up the organisation, perhaps a board of directors or even a chief executive at the top. And the same in public organisations and even charities as well. A focus on the power resting in with the narrow few. Really, at a societal level, we see that in terms of the way we organise the country. The difference is, to a certain extent, at a country level, we do have authority rests in the hands of a few, but in a country level, in our government, to a certain extent, there's a democracy there. In organisations, it's not in a democratic way. So, to a certain extent, and a limited extent, we have a say on how our organisation is run. That will depend on where we sit in the organisation. But for most of us, we have a limited influence on the organisation, unless we do sit at that top level. So that gives some people an extensive amount of power, but for many people, it gives a sense of powerlessness, an inability to make things happen. So this unequal relationships concentration of power in the hands of a few, decision-making authority, actually is key to understanding how our organisations are run. And we increasingly in our talk about leadership emphasise this, emphasise the importance. Leadership itself emphasises the importance of that. The other part of that is, so we've got unequal relationships, authority in the hands of a few. That inevitably means control of resources in the hands of a few. So, which usually means money. So that control over resources is also rested in the hands of a few as well. So most of us, if we want to make change happen, we have to get permission, we have to get authority, we have to make a bid for funding, we have to put business cases in. And it's often not us that's making the decision on that. So that gives people quite a lot of power and influence in an organisation. The other part is organisations are set up really, and the nature of organisations is to be quite competitive. I'm going to put competition there just to make that clear. So a feature of organisations is competition. Part of that is driven in a healthy way in some ways by career progression, people's ambition. We're competing with others to progress. So competition in some ways is healthy. It does drive, it's driven by our own need to achieve things. So there's a healthy, positive, productive side to that. But clearly when you've got unequal resources, control of resources which are also finite as well. So there's competition over resources as well. It's rare to be in a position where there's an unlimited amount of resource. So there's competition over resource, competition over opportunity, competition over decision-making power and authority. The competition, and the final one I think is, I'm going to call it pluralism. Useful word to think about, pluralism. Pluralism relates to different interests. People talk about stakeholders, but if we think about the interests of different, perhaps people at different levels in the organisation, different teams, different specialisms, they've got different interests. The interests of the top of the organisation might be different to what I want as an individual, to what my interests are. One of the most common organisational changes, particularly where resources are scarce or where perhaps there's a downturn in the economy, we have downsizing, we have reorganisations, we have efficiency drives. Much of that is against the interests of many people in the organisation. We have redundancies, etc. That is clearly not in the interest. It might be in the interests of the organisation. It might be in the interests of the top people in the organisation. They might end up being rewarded for making the organisation more efficient, for slimming down the organisation, whatever euphemisms we use for that. Clearly that's not in the interests of the people that lose their jobs. And pluralism means different interests. A unitary organisation would be where everybody has the same goal, everybody shares the same goal, everybody actually is aligned to the same organisational goal. The reality is we've got competing interests, we've got a mixture of interests, and they're not always totally compatible. So that is the landscape that we're trying to bring about change in. Unequal relationships, competition over resources and position and authority, pluralism, senses of powerlessness, and all that goes with that. Now, really, universities and higher education generally used to speak a lot more about these things. We used to have whole courses and whole modules on industrial relations. And in some ways, that's partly what we're talking about here. It seems to have gone out of fashion in some ways, industrial relations, partly because our economies aren't seen as highly industrial anymore. People talk about post-industrial age. And in some ways it went out of fashion. It was seen as what we did in the 70s when we had major strikes, major industrial walkouts. And it's almost as if that's moved on. But in some ways, if we just substituted industrial for work or organisational relations, it would be quite useful. And I think it's a bit that's probably missing from some of our education that we deliver now, our curriculum. So I'm trying to put a bit more of this back in. Okay, so what's the value of that? Well, in some ways what I'm suggesting is, I'll just put a little line around that. Let's just put a little line around that part there. Okay, so that's that section. So what is the value of this part, this messiness that I've described in organisations? Well, really what I'm saying is this is useful for theorising. Theorising or explaining the problematic nature of change. We've spoken several times about how problematic change is. Spoke about this 70% failure. So this is a lens, this is a way of theorising and explaining why change is so difficult. And this lens of politics, power, and the messiness of work and industrial relations is an explanation of why change is so difficult to achieve. In some ways it explains that change gap. We spoke about earlier, we often have an ambition to achieve a certain change, a future desired state, and most of the time we either gradually approach that or we totally fail to achieve that. So what we're trying to do is explain that gap. And also what we're trying to do, what the value of it is, it also explains some of the phenomena that we experience when we implement change. So problematic nature of change, and particular the phenomena or the things we experience when we're implementing change. And I really want to cover those, so I'll just block that area off as well. So that's the sort of theoretical lens. That's the value of it in terms of making sense of, so we can understand it better. If we can understand it better, we can develop our practice. And I'm just going to, there's a number of ways we could describe this or theorise this. I want to look at three phenomena really, which I think relate to some of the problematic nature of change. What are the things we experience when we're doing change? I'm going to look at three of those. One is conflict. I would argue very little change that involves people, that is complex, that is worth doing, is inevitably going to involve some conflict of various types. Closely related, that is this idea of resistance. that one of the phenomena that we commonly experience if we've been tasked with leading change, or we're part of a change project, or just trying to improve a situation, or bring about an improvement in conditions, we'll meet some resistance. And the third one, perhaps this is something we wouldn't often deal with it in this way, is a phenomenon which I'm calling conformance. Something from a conventional management point we'd often consider is something that is desirable. But I'm questioning that. I'm critiquing the notion that conformance is always a good thing. And in the same way, I'm critiquing the idea that resistance is always a bad thing. So in our conventional approach to change, we'd see that as bad and that as good. And that as bad as well. I'm saying that these are phenomena that we experience, and they're not entirely good or bad. Maybe in productive change we do need an element of all of these, but these are things that we will come up against, phenomenon that we experience, and I'm sure you can relate to those. So, how does this model explain these phenomena? Well, the conflict really comes from this idea of different interests and pluralism. Because we've got different interests in the organisation, as soon as we try to change things, we're inevitably going to be impacting on somebody's interests. And we're dealing really with competing interests. Even conflicting interests or incompatible. We might bring about a change that's in the interests of quite a number of people in the organisation, but others are affected in a negative way. And this is where we talk about people having agendas. Often again we use that in a negative way, but clearly we do have an agenda, we have our own interests, and it's healthy in some ways for us to try and protect our own interests. And change will inevitably impact on people's interests. And sometimes conflict is a way that will resolve those differences. And in some ways, if we try and work without that conflict, those interests will never come to any sort of common agreement or some sort of consensus. Those competing interests will still be there. And perhaps that's why the change never really takes place, because we'll never resolve those conflicts. So change in some ways is about resolving the conflicts, not sort of burying them or ignoring them. But that's a difficult thing to do. It's inevitable in some ways that we'll have some winners and losers. So this conflict, it's inevitable because organisations of anything other than a very small size are likely to have a range of different and competing interests. And change is about dealing with that in some way to resolve that and to come to some sort of consensus, so it's complex. In the conventional sense, we often say, well, the way we resolve this is just providing a more compelling vision, communicating the message better. Well, in some ways I would argue that's naive. However good our communication is, if we're not dealing with these underlying challenges to people's interests and finding a way to deal with that and resolve that, change will just simply not occur in an effective way. It might occur on the surface, but it doesn't happen underneath. Again, resistance is something that goes back to what we've spoken about before in terms of our anthropology and our evolution. Resistance in some ways is hardwired into us. in some ways it's healthy, and it goes back to our protecting our autonomy. To survive, to move, to protect our interests, to keep ourselves safe, actually protecting our own autonomy, that's hardwired into us. We have a need for autonomy, and we find that psychologically challenged when that's undermined. And in a conventional view of change, again, resistance is seen as resistance to the particular change itself. And actually, again, that a more critical view, and I would argue a less naive view, is actually whatever the change that's happening is, actually the resistance comes from this hardwired need for autonomy. We're resistant to people telling us what to do, imposing their power on us. We want control. We don't want to lose control. And change is often about a loss of control. However benign the organisation, however ethical and thoughtful the leadership is, or the people bringing about the change, inevitably it will engage in a loss of control. If change is being done to us, we've got less control. It's very unsettling. So this resistance is natural and probably healthy as well. If there was no resistance, how does that stop bad ideas? How does that really test how good the ideas are if there's no resistance at all to that change? So inevitably what we're doing when we're bringing about change, we're impacting on this area, because change will inevitably change in some way the balance of control. It actually goes back to this asymmetrical and unequal relationships. Change actually may make a difference to these. It might mean that people feel even a greater extent of powerlessness. It might put more power in the people at the top, or a particular group might be given more authority and power over somebody else, or an individual. So it's almost a natural reaction that we resist anything that changes the current balance of power. And also it goes back to control of resources as well. Part of our autonomy and our healthy need for autonomy is about our access and our control of resources. And when we're bringing about change in an organisation, we're often impacting on that and making a difference to that. So I think we need to think about resistance as a natural phenomenon. It's hardwired into us as human beings. It's a natural phenomenon in response to organisational change. And it can have both negative and positive consequences. So it might be a very important change that we need to bring in that actually reduces harm to certain groups or makes the organisation more ethical and sustainable. But there will still be a natural resistance to that because it's changing and impacting what people do, perhaps getting them to work in different ways. So that is a negative side to it. But resistance can be positive, where changes that are brought in perhaps aren't good solutions, they're poor solutions. And actually resistance is important there. And the other one, really, this other thing that we do experience when change is brought in is that people do conform, that people do go along with the change, they do conform to the change. And that is something that we experience quite regularly as well. And although we've got a hardwired sense of needing our own autonomy, on the other side of authority as well, because we're highly social creatures, that groups have always worked with some forms of hierarchy, and for our own safety and survival, we've in human groups, we've recognised the importance of having some authority in the group. So it's quite hardwired into us as well that we're obedient to authority. So this is very powerful. People in powerful positions, as human beings, we tend to respond and conform to that. It's quite hard to be a heretic and be resistant. And I put a link on the resources to the quite well-known Milgram experiment, been repeated several times, but explains how when people are put in particular positions, they will actually respond to people or people they perceive are in positions of authority. We tend to conform to that. Organisations wouldn't work in some ways if we didn't have that. And if we think about highly hierarchical, bureaucratic organisations, in some ways that's why we have uniforms. That's why we have very highly symbolic things that represent authority, because it reinforces this need to conform and to be obedient to that. So we've got two competing things as human beings. We are obedient because that's in our self-interest as well, but we've got this competing thing of authority. The problem is that often means that it's superficial. It often leads to lip service. So we know we think something might be a really bad idea, or it might serve us in the short term, but we tend to play lip service to it. And the problem there is that really, again, that's why that change gap occurs. People on the surface are conforming because it's their own survival and self-interest. Perhaps it will be career limiting to resist that change or to speak out. But that means people go along with or just pay lip service. And that's why we end up with not achieving the change. People are going through the motions, but there's no real change. And people in authority perhaps think the change has occurred, but really underlying that, particularly related to culture and attitudes and more fundamental behaviours, little change has happened. The problem with conformance is it might make life quite easy for somebody who's leading a change. It might give the appearance that the change is very successful, things go very smoothly, projects move smoothly as tasks are carried out. The problem is, because a lot of the decision making is rested in the hands of a few, the approach or the decisions about the change might have been made by quite a narrow group. We can end up with having very poor decisions. Just because people at the top of a very large organisation just don't simply have enough knowledge. They can never have enough knowledge of what it's like to actually, what the real conditions are on the ground. So they're making decisions quite separated from what's happening on the ground, what's happening really in the real organisation. They have to take quite a simplistic view on a narrow amount of information. And that inevitably ends to poor decisions or poor solutions. And that's inevitable. The problem is, if we've got high degree of conformance, which tends to flow from hierarchical organisations, there'll be very little to provide some resistance or counter to that, because people would tend to go along with poor decisions and poor solutions. And that's why, again, we end up with a gap, because we've had very narrow decision making by a very narrow group based on probably particular interests again, narrow interests, and that leads to poor decisions. So those are phenomena that really we experience when we're implementing change, and also explain why we get this change gap, why we get this high failure rate, why we always experience these phenomena. So just drawing to a conclusion, what does that mean for practice? I'm going to put this the so what. All very good to talk about that, all makes sense in the abstract, but what does that mean for, what are the implications for us as managers, professionals, leaders, whichever role we're in? Many of us are in a position where we're tasked with bringing about change, implementing a new strategy, a new policy, improving performance in a team or a department. In some ways, if we think about our annual challenges that we're given, our work objectives are about bringing about organisational change at some degree. So we're all faced with these problems, we're all faced with these phenomena when we're trying to achieve our own objectives which relate to organisational change. And really what the implications, I would argue, are that actually to bring about change we need political skills. There might be lots of tools and techniques around change, but I would argue the most important aspect is that managers, leaders, professionals, anybody bringing about change, actually they're more likely to be able to close the gap or less likelihood of failure if they've got political skills, if they've got some knowledge of the messy landscape. So this is quite messy. It isn't a flat terrain. We've got to climb over a number of hurdles that the organisation throws up. If we're more realistic, less naive, we understand this messy landscape or this messy terrain, we've got some skills to try and resolve and deal with these problems that we will inevitably face. Actually, we're more likely, it doesn't guarantee success in any way, but we're more likely to be able to overcome some of those challenges, and ultimately, in more cases, will improve the likelihood, but we'll have less of a gap between what we set out to achieve and what we achieved in the end. And I'll bring that to a close there.